Okay, good evening. On Monday, March 31st, before a storm, I went to the Trans Day of Visibility on the mall at between 3rd and 4th Street late in the afternoon. And um, just to show you what I came up with, there's going to be a Gaza demonstration. There's going to be a big protest of everything on the mall near the monument on Saturday, April 5th.
Have no place in Congress.
One of the videos.
This History Project builds and leverages the power to make equity a reality for trans people across the country, and we are fighting desperately for the pro-trans Congress we desperately need and deserve. Our guiding principle is courage. 56 years ago, that courage was demonstrated by the queer and trans people who led the Stonewall riots.
It certainly is true. That certainly is true that the Park Service should not have taken down the mention of the trans participation in the Stonewall riots back, in 1969, because that's history. That certainly is true. Some more pictures. Here's another video.
Most of the people here are cis. That's what's funny. Most of the people here are not trans.
So, I'm calling out the people in the building behind me, trying to erase our existence. We are here, we are paying attention, and we are ready to fight. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us today, and I'm honored to pass the microphone to Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch, President and CEO of Interfaith Alliance.
Okay. Um, I do want to talk about a couple of other things first, and I'll come back to these videos and talk about the problem that's leaving. We're all concerned about the tariffs, and my own feeling is, well, remember the Arab oil embargo in 1973? It's dangerous to be too dependent on imported materials, and it's dangerous even to depend too much on cheap labor overseas, like almost slave labor conditions in Chinese shops with teenagers that live in dorms. It's dangerous for us to be dependent on that, and you might have to go cold turkey sometimes. We could have done this a lot better, but I don't know. I don't know if you can get people to do this without shock treatment sometimes. So I'm not sure that Trump is completely wrong on this. It sounds like we're breaking the system, but we got big problems with climate change and great problems with inequality. I'm going to talk about that we're not making much progress on. And so a lot of us might be affected. Now, it's easy for me to say because I'm old and 81 and may not have many years left, but that could affect, if you believe in reincarnation or something, that could affect my next life if I'm going to have one. But um, yeah, it may be May 3rd before all the auto stuff comes in. The iPhones might be a lot more expensive very suddenly. I'm not sure what's all going to happen, but I want to get back to the issue here. When we keep on talking about LGBTQ people, and I resent being included in that because I'm just the G, and I don't have any sense of identity by labeling identity other than biological as far as what should be on a legal document. Um, you can think of even being gay, a gay cis person or something as an identity if you want, but it shouldn't be a label. And but and so I kind of resent it when I hear myself being dragged into. I'm supposed to get dragged into it. I don't need the pronouns, and I don't want to have to support questionable drugs and for minors, which I don't think the medical industries and the pharmacists have acted in good faith about. There's a lot more doubt as to whether this is okay. They will really be okay about what they were trying to do, which was maybe escape a normal puberty completely and just go transition right at 18, whether that's even feasible. But if you can't do that, then everything else falls apart. Social transitioning and lower grades in high school, if you're not going to be allowed to do that, as in many states are stopping, and the Supreme Court will probably agree, then what happens when you're 16 or 17 years old in gym class and you've gone through puberty and you want to believe you're the other gender? What happens then? Now, I recently took this up in a letter that I sent to all the beneficiaries of my trust, because HRC is one of them. And I talked about this at the end of this letter, letter, which I posted on my WordPress site in the pages rather than as a blog post. But if I think about my own situation, I fell behind as a child physically. Wasn't able to do what I was expected to do as a boy. And maybe measles had something to do with it in 1950. Maybe it was something epigenetic. But I was an only child. It wasn't birth order. But the birth order theory seems to make some sense. I uh, found myself dealing with it by wanting to identify with men that were superior to me, that were both smart and strong. So why not affiliate yourself with the best people? And that's the way you can bring yourself up. And that led me to being attracted to men. And then I eventually, I came out a second time. I've told the story of my expulsion from William and Mary, which was largely because in the first semester in 1961, which was largely because if somebody was suspected of even being latently homosexual, it would make the other boys in the barracks unsure as to who you could be attracted to, or make them less secure they were going to grow up to be normal themselves and marry and have children, which was more what the real reason was. That was how they thought back in 1961, the beginning of the Kennedy illustration. I did shape up, and I wound up straightening my reputation by actually canceling the 4F and actually taking the draft physical 2 more times and becoming 1A and being 2As, being in the Army for 2 years, although I never went to Vietnam. I wound up in special training in the Army, and I had to deal with my physical inability. And I finally got to a point that I was reasonably strong, had reasonable strength and upper body strength. Got, in the Army, and got to 357 on the PCPT test finally. And I had to deal with it. And so my attitude is, well, so should other people if I had to. Came out and then started a gay lifestyle in New York, and then I had a certain attempt at a relationship that sort of, I wanted it to leave. I wanted a new scene. I moved to Texas, and Dallas was very interesting, but that's when the AIDS epidemic struck in Dallas in the about a year later than in New York. But because I was relatively less attractive and relatively less active, I escaped getting it. And but I became very active in all the medical research and everything, and very outspoken about it. Things got better with the medicine and the anti-HIV. In the 90s, things were getting better, much better, and a more libertarian idea what your private life was your own business sort of thing. That was about you can do what you want if you don't hurt other people. Lawrence versus Texas, we overturned the sodomy law. But in other parts of the world, this isn't working out very well, and there's some threat, even not just to trans, but to gay people themselves, in the sense that a lot of people, particularly on the religious right, are concerned about the birth rate, and that we're not even exposure to material about gender nonconformity. And these today, the kids that are at issue are gender nonconforming in their behavior, as I was. But that doesn't mean they're trans. It just means they have trouble um, doing the things that are expected for their biological sex and fitting in. Even though they have a very clear biological sex, they are not as um, competitive as people that are more in the higher up in that curve, and so they're not thought of well personally. So it would be natural. It would be very logical to want people to have some other logical label, so they wouldn't have to be thought of, judged by their sex. So gender is very convenient. But there's even a much bigger reason why this is a problem. If you stop and think about it, there's been ever since even the 70s, for the past half century, since the 70s, since after Stonewall, we've had pride celebrations, and mainstream media has gradually covered gay issues much more than it did in the past. With the milk assassination in San Francisco in '78, and the AIDS epidemic, and then Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the '90s, which I wrote the book on, and compared the idea of intimacy in the barracks to intimacy in a dorm. That was sort of the main theme of the book. Um, and then the internet came along about the time of my book being published. You could put anything you wanted out there and people would find it on search engines, even before we had the algorithms of social media, which came along like after 2008 or so. After about the time of the first financial crisis, we came out of that with um, soon with much more aggressive social media. And then that seemed it had a golden age for a few years until about 2015. All of a sudden, our society was becoming much more polarized than we thought, and Trump won. And now it's even more polarized since then. And I think what happened is that the schools were caught in a situation where people were talking about non-gender conforming behavior. And it's not just about sex and about porn sites, although we've talked about that before, and the state laws and so forth. It was about the fact of just ideas about whether you should, um, whether everybody should grow up and expect to marry and have a family and have kids, which is what the right wants. And if people marry early, they'll have more kids. And there might even be more gay kids because of the birth order thing, if you didn't do anything else. But they'll have more kids. But because people have to stay in school longer and get more, and particularly women, we've gotten away from that. So people aren't marrying until their 30s. And a lot of times they don't want kids or they have very few of them. That's more the demographic reason for the birth rate. But a lot of people, particularly in Russia and in Hungary with Orban, they believe that gay propaganda is interfering with people wanting to marry and have children. And so there are very strict laws now in Hungary you might have heard about recently being passed about even pride events and going to pride events and putting things on the internet and so forth. So one of the things I've been very concerned about is laws that might require age verification for everything on the internet, which maybe you could do it at the device level. That's what Pornhub wants. That might be the best way to do it. We probably face that soon. But the other thing that's very striking about gender ideology and the trans, the trans visibility, the videos I showed. The other thing that's very striking is the insistence that people recognize trans women as actual women, and conversely, but it's more who gets to be calling themselves a woman. That is going the other direction. It's not much of a problem with sports and even restrooms. But um, if you actually consider trans women to be women in an existential sense, then theoretically, that would mean that trans people are marginalized groups and they can protect their civil rights that way. If they're not considered a legitimate group, then it's back to to protecting your individual rights with due process logic rather than equal protection. And that's much harder to secure in the courts right now. It's much easier to use equal protection. Excuse me. Alito talked about that. And so that's become the problem. Um, is that you can't question whether trans people are genuinely the other sex or genuinely even non-binary, something. You can't question how they want to characterize themselves with self-ID, question the fact that they have a group because of the legal risk. But the schools needed to present something that wasn't about sex. Excuse me, it wasn't about sex or libidos. You can talk about identity in third grade in school, but you can't talk about libido or sex itself. So gender identity was a very convenient thing. So you can't afford to have it questioned or the whole thing comes down. And that gets back to age verifying everything and limiting access to adults and much more restricted environment, even for gay people, not just trans people. I just hope you understand why trans activists have been so insistent. Why they've been so insistent. And I do thank you for listening.